Recording in progress.
Okay. All right then. Thank you very much, Claire, and good evening, everyone. So for those of you who do not know me, my name is Matt Meyer. I'm a reference librarian at Tippecanoe County Public Library. I recognize a few of you from when I did my library program here back in April, and a couple others I've met when I'm just being at the library. And tonight I'm going to be doing a presentation called Diamond Crusade Black Baseball in Lafayette. I am very, very excited tonight to be here for this program. And it's not just because I get to speak uninterrupted about baseball for 45 minutes, which is a dream come true in one way.
You're not going to talk for an hour and a half?
I could easily.
I'm disappointed.
Instead, what really makes me excited about this program is the simple fact that in the course of doing research for this and also articles for the upcoming bicentennial book, this is a story that really has just not been told in great detail. There's passing mentions of it here and there, nothing real significant. So this is really, to my knowledge, the first real exploration of Black baseball in Lafayette, by extension, Tippecanoe County. So tonight, I just want to give a quick overview of what I'll be talking about. So I'll do a brief introduction where I'll talk about sort of the narrative that I want to establish for this program, the resources that I used, and also a brief historiography of what research in Black baseball has looked like and how it's evolved over the last few years. From there, I will talk about first baseball games in Lafayette, and then which will lead me to the first big story of our program, which is Bud Fowler's story in 1888. From there, I'll talk about Richard Smith, who is credited as being the first Black baseball player at Purdue. I'll also talk about the Pals and the Radios, which were two teams here in Lafayette. And then finally wrapping it up with exhibitions by Black teams against white teams here in Lafayette, World War II, and leading up to Jackie Robinson, when he played here in 1945. So to get started then with the narrative that I've kind of constructed going through research for this program and for those articles has been this idea of community baseball. Lafayette historically has always been home to amateur teams, semi-pro teams, very few professional teams. Amateur in the sense of high school, college, World Series, which was here for 50 years. So really, baseball where you're not being paid to play, essentially. There's been some semi-pro teams and a few short-lived professional teams, but those were very few and far between. The professional teams really only existed in the 1900s, the 50s, and then briefly in the 1990s. So because these teams were not professional, they're not bound by any kind of money. So this is all community. These are just your next door neighbors playing on the teams. They're guys who work at the bank you go to, the grocery store you go to. So these are people that you just know and see in your everyday life. So you develop strong bonds with them because of that. Because they're not bound by money, they're not being lured away to a team that pays them more. But within that narrative, there is a key component that's missing, and that is the Black baseball experience in Lafayette. Most of Lafayette's baseball history focuses on white teams. So introducing Black baseball sort of augments that narrative and creates a more cohesive community. So just a very, very brief overview of sort of the historiography of Black baseball research. It really started taking hold in the 1960s. And then from there, it just kind of snowballed as researchers started examining Negro League baseball games to establish the Negro Leagues as being Major League caliber. In 2021, Major League Baseball announced that they were going to incorporate Negro League statistics into the official record books. They chose the years between 1920 and 1948 as being the most cohesive and stable years for the Negro League. So only between those years are the stats counted in the official MLB record book. And they finally just completed that in May of just this year, actually, so just a few months ago. It's been a very long process, and we're finally happy to see now that with the incorporation of these stats into the official record book, we now have new stats leaders, and a lot of them are Negro League players. So now guys like Ty Cobb, they are not leaders anymore. It's now Josh Gibson, players like that. And a lot of that was done through the Steamheads Negro League database, which is just this giant encyclopedia that you can go into and you can look up all the box scores for all these different Negro League teams and all the different years that they played. So I could go to 1945, I could look up all the games the Kansas City Monarchs played that year in Negro League baseball, and I could look up all the box scores, the stats, the players, everything. But doing that required a lot of intensive research using newspapers, because with black baseball, there are no centralized resources like there are in Major League Baseball. There's not just one official record book. Everything is scattered and incomplete. And when I say scattered, that means a lot of it is found in newspapers just all across the country, requiring just a lot of intensive newspaper research, which presents just a multitude of challenges. So newspapers, you can divide them into two categories. We have black newspapers and white newspapers. Black press and black baseball go hand in hand. Black newspapers advocated for integration. Black baseball put that advocacy into action. It was demonstrating the quality of black baseball that way. The problem, at least in Indiana, is that black newspapers were only published in cities with large black populations. So Indianapolis, Evansville, and later Gary being examples. There were no black newspapers in Lafayette at all. And Indiana's black newspapers are weeklies and not dailies, meaning that a lot of games would not be covered just because they're only published one day a week rather than 6 or 7 days a week. And with this particular article here from the Indianapolis Recorder, down here at the bottom, you can see that the Birmingham Black Barons, it mentions that they're going to play the Lafayette Red Sox in July of 1945. An article like that in an Indianapolis paper was an exception and not the norm. So I was not really able to use the Recorder in any way just because it didn't cover baseball in Lafayette. Like it just never really covered black teams when they would visit Lafayette. So this was just a diamond in the rough, essentially, just one of the very few things I was able to use in the Recorder. So because of those challenges, we had to integrate black newspapers with white newspapers, but there's some problems there too. The first off being racial biases. Coverage often skewed to one side, not a favorable side either at that. But within Lafayette newspapers, there was the News of the Colored People column. This was published starting in the 1800s, and it went up into the 1950s in the Journal and Courier. And this was sort of like a societal column written about the everyday happenings of black citizens in Lafayette. So it would be something like, so-and-so went to Chicago for a weekend, or they saw friends last night, something like that. But not a lot of baseball coverage in those columns, though. You might see the occasional baseball player in there doing something, but nothing covering the actual games. So you can only go so far with those. Sometimes the games were given minimal coverage, and sometimes they're on random pages. There was a couple of Lafayette radio games that I found that were on the women's page of the Journal and Courier. Why are they on the women's page and not the sports page? I have no idea. Speaking as a former editor-in-chief of the Exponent, my guess is that they probably just had to fill space somewhere, so they put the article there. I kind of know how they feel on that one. And not all newspapers are digitized, which means microfilm comes into the story. As I'm sure some of you have even used these microfilm reels from TCPL for that matter. So in this case, I mainly use 4 newspapers for my research. I used the Courier, the Journal and Courier, and the Exponent. I used the Call and the Sunday Times just to verify dates and get a little more insight into events. And I did not use the Lafayette Leader, and I will explain why this slide. So here we have 2 articles covering a game against the Kansas City Monarchs in July of 1945. This is actually the Jackie Robinson game that I'll talk about later on in the presentation. Over on the left, over on that side with the Journal and Courier, you see that it gives you full gameplay coverage. You get the box score. The coverage actually went the entire length of the page. I had to divide that into like 3 different files when I scanned it off the microfilm. So you get a lot more in-depth coverage that way. The Leader, being a weekly, published this, a much smaller story, doesn't give you play-by-play action, and it doesn't even mention Jackie Robinson playing in the game. So in this case, the Leader was just not useful for this purpose because their sports coverage typically was sporadic, wasn't always very consistent. And within the Journal and Courier, there are 2 heavy hitters that I come to rely on for this project. First one is Gordon Graham, who is a longtime Journal and Courier sports columnist who wrote the Graham Crackers column for 33 years. Get it? Graham crackers ran usually about 4 days a week, maybe 5, and it just included a lot of his insights into sporting events that happened, little tidbits of information that he would pick up, things like that. And at the top there, that little clipping of the Graham Crackers article, you see that Graham was very supportive of black baseball, saying that that night fans would be seeing the best Negro baseball players, and they should decide for themselves who these players should actually be in the major leagues and not in the Negro leagues. From Graham, we go to Bob Kriebel, who I think we all know at this point. I don't think I need to do too much explaining about Bob Kriebel. As I tell patients at TCPL, all local history research begins with Bob Kriebel. So it's, I think we all know kind of what his place is. And of course, his old Lafayette columns ran from 1977 to 2011. Invaluable is probably an understatement. Honestly, I could go on just how much I love reading those for doing research projects. Kriebel wrote on baseball occasionally, not a lot, and even fewer mentions of black baseball in his columns. This particular one at the bottom from Old Lafayette mentions that the Monarchs played the Lafayette Red Sox, including when they featured Jackie Robinson and Satchel Paige. This was part of a 10-part series on the Monarchs, or on the Red Sox, that Kriebel did, and very useful, but at the same time, this is all he mentioned of Jackie Robinson playing in Lafayette. There's no dates of the game, there's no results of the game, so it required a lot more intensive research to actually find when that game was. In fact, the research was so intensive, I made a program out of it at TCPL showing patients how to use our local history resources to find a topic, because it was just such a fascinating journey that I went on to actually find that game. So, one last bit before I actually get into the rest of the program, and that is just, why Lafayette Black baseball? And so, it offers a glimpse into local Black history. And it gives us a better understanding of the culture surrounding baseball, understanding the racial discrimination that was prevalent in baseball really from the 1800s up until when Jackie Robinson, and even after Jackie Robinson integrated the majors in 1947. It augments the existing narrative that I've established of community baseball. And one other thing, when Major League Baseball announced that they were going to incorporate the stats into the official record book, they only count the stats of Negro League games. So like if Kansas City played Chicago, they would count that stat. They would not count the stats of Kansas City playing Lafayette in like semi-pro teams. So because of that, Lafayette kind of helps fill in those gaps, because now we know, if Kansas City was here, then they stopped in Lafayette before going on to the next destination to play a game. So we kind of are filling in that historical gap. And we also discovered that Lafayette, being in close proximity to Indy, Chicago, was actually a stopping point for a lot of these Negro League teams when they came here, because they were able to play in Lafayette for a night and then go on their way to wherever else they needed to go. So the first part I'm going to talk about then is early Lafayette baseball and Bud Fowler. So following the Civil War's conclusion in 1865, baseball just expanded greatly across the nation. All the soldiers were going home, they took baseball with them, and they established all these teams in different cities across the country. Here in Lafayette, the earliest games that I've found were played in 1866 in a series against Indianapolis. What they would have done is that the teams took out advertisements in the newspapers issuing challenges to the opposing team, and then that team would respond in the other team's newspaper saying, "We accept your challenge on this date and we'll play you then." So they played Indianapolis for a series to determine the championship of the state. And it was a 3-game series, and Lafayette lost 2 of the games. They played one here in Lafayette and one in Indianapolis. The game developed further in Lafayette. By 1877, the Daily Courier was offering a silver bat to sort of like a city league. So whoever won that league was awarded the bat. Purdue won the bat that year. Nationally, baseball is growing even more. The very first professional game between 2 professional teams was played in Fort Wayne in 1871. But with all of that growth, it becomes a national sport, but for who? So early Black baseball players, let me rephrase that. A lot of people think that Jackie Robinson was the first Black baseball player in 1947. That is not entirely true. In the 1800s, there were several Black baseball players, but they faced such rampant discrimination that they did not last long. Civil War brought new freedoms, but segregation was still in force. And in Indiana, black baseball teams were reported as early as 1867 in Indianapolis. Blacks played on integrated teams, but they did so at their own risk. And what this meant was that a lot of times they would be spiked in the shins by opposing players. They would be thrown down run down. They would just get all kinds of violence, pitches thrown at them. Any kind of violence basically to say, you're not welcome here. And at the time, there were 4 significant black baseball players. There was Moses Walker, who is right here. He is the first major league black baseball player. His brother, Weldy Walker, Saul White, who I believe played in Fort Wayne for a few years in the 1890s, and then Bud Fowler. Fowler is the earliest known professional black baseball player. He debuted in 1878 for a team in Massachusetts, and before that, he was an Oberlin College graduate. So he was actually a very, very smart man. He was born in Cooperstown, New York, which, for those of you who don't know, is home of the Baseball Hall of Fame, and supposedly where baseball was invented. Fowler was spiked so often that he created wooden shin guards to put around his legs to prevent from being shinned. And, you know, even though he was constantly being released by teams and traveling across the country to play, he ended up like out in Colorado at one point to play baseball. He just went wherever he could find work. The reason why he did that was because baseball was steady work that paid well at the time. So, you know, the risk, I guess, in a way was worth the reward. So in 1888, Fowler signs to play with the team in Lafayette, arriving from Utica. The previous year in 1887, he was released by the team in Binghamton because the Binghamton team, they had signed an agreement saying they would not sign any more black players, and they released Fowler. So in 1888, Lafayette had a team in the Central Interstate League. This was a league that had teams in places like Danville, Illinois, Bloomington, Crawfordsville, and I think Springfield as well. So Fowler comes to Lafayette. He introduces himself to management, and management releases him right on the spot. Management supposedly was not aware that Fowler was black, and because of that, they released him, and he went to the team in Crawfordsville. Fowler was told that the Lafayette team would only consist of strawberry blondes, and the Daily Courier provides the best coverage of this incident. The Daily Journal was not a whole lot, but the Courier actually went much more depth. And at one point, the Courier said it was failure of Fowler to send his photo as requested by management. They tried to put the blame on him rather than on management. Fowler naturally did not like that. And so he responded a few days later in the Daily Courier. He wrote a much longer reply. I just scanned the top part of it for this. And in that response, it's a very well-written response. Fowler wrote that management not knowing his race was very queer indeed, as he put it. And in reference to having black players on teams, Fowler argued, we draw people to your games, so why are you getting rid of us when we could be drawing more people to your games, making you more money that way? And then finally, he concluded saying that he was sorry to know that such a great intelligent body of Lafayette men should be so prejudiced to color at that time. But that's not it. That is not where the story ends, actually. Fowler returns to Lafayette about a month later to play, because Crawfordsville was in the same league with Lafayette, so they came up here to play Lafayette. They played in April of 1888 at a park over in Linwood. I don't know where the park was exactly. I do know that it held about 500 people, and it had a clubhouse and a ladies only section. So, you know, something fancy, I guess. The Crawfordsville newspapers, they vowed revenge. They said, we're going to go to Lafayette. We are going to do up Lafayette for this wrong they committed against Fowler. Lafayette newspapers, on the other hand, basically just yawned and said, yeah, sure, fine. Show us what you got. They were very arrogant in their attitude towards what they'd done to Fowler. Fortunately for Crawfordsville, they ended up losing both games. And Fowler committed an error. If you look at the box score at the top, Fowler is the 4th one up. He was 0 for 3, and he committed an error in that game. So probably my guess would be the stress just going back. I'm sure the fans were just on him the entire time. Probably just wasn't in the right mental space during this game. I don't know if he played in the first game because I've not found a box score for that one. The only box score I've found is just for the second game. So in the aftermath of this, Lafayette's newspapers, they had a field day. It is just, It's really jarring to read what they were saying. The Daily Journal said Crawfordsville blew too hard, they made too much of this. The Daily Courier said the wins brought satisfaction because they were able to shut Crawfordsville up, basically. The Sunday Times was another one. It was very snarky in its responses to the Fowler game. So there's just there was a lot of coverage of this particular game when Fowler came to Lafayette. Joke was kind of on Lafayette's team though, because they disbanded a few months later in 1888. And Fowler himself was finally inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 2022, recognized as a pioneering Black player. So I guess you could say Lafayette won the battle, but Fowler ended up winning the war, right? So just, Fowler ended up being recognized for his place in baseball history. But with that said, one last note on this. I've seen very little research on this particular incident when Fowler came to Lafayette, and the research that I have seen, they used Logan Sports newspapers to talk about this event and not Lafayette's newspapers. So I don't know why they use Logan Sport, but at any rate, so now we kind of have what we didn't have using Lafayette's newspapers, which I'm very excited about for that. So from Fowler, we go to Richard Smith, the pals, and the radios. And this is probably the most community-oriented part of the presentation. Kind of really, because these are all kind of community grown teams. So who is Richard Smith? Richard Smith was a pharmacy student at Purdue who graduated in 1904. He was one of 2 Blacks in his class that year. The 1904 debris, from which this picture comes from, lists him as the best baseball player in the class. After graduation, he opened his own pharmacy in Indianapolis. And fun fact, his daughter was married to Louis Armstrong for a few years. I think she was like his 3rd wife at that point or something. Louis had a few wives. I think she was his 3rd or 4th. And Smith is typically credited as being Purdue's first Black baseball player. I've seen some posts from Purdue Archives about this. I've also seen an Exponent article about this as well. So I did more research into this, and while I still believe that he is indeed the first Black baseball player at Purdue, I don't think it's as cut and dry as some people would have you think. And first off, that's because in the early 1900s, college athletics, much like professional baseball, was very antagonistic towards Black players. Some universities even refused to compete with teams that had Black players on their rosters. Fans would yell racial taunts at opposing players, including in a football game that Purdue played against Michigan in the 1890s when they taunted George Jewett with racial epithets. And in 1903 Exponent, there was a letter to the editor in one of the issues asking if it was gentlemanly to yell racial insults at the Beloit football team when they visited Purdue that year for a football game. So these were very adverse conditions that Smith would have been playing in at that time. To compound that, Smith is not featured in the baseball team photo in the 1904 debris, which suggests that he may not even have been on the varsity team. He may have played on the intramural team. But when you do newspaper research, in the Exponent, the Courier, the Journal, and the Call, you find in several box scores that there's a Smith listed, but there's no other Smith listed on the team. Not one in the team photo, not any other one that I can find. So this particular Smith appeared in games against Indiana State and IU. He may have started against Northwestern. I've not verified that except for the Exponent. The Exponent is the only newspaper I found that mentions that so far. The Exponent also lists Smith's batting average, which is consistent with so few appearances. It was a very low batting average, like around 120 something. So very low, which is consistent with him not making very many appearances in games. So I still think that he is the first Black baseball player at Purdue. I don't think he was there for very long just because of the racial situation at the time, but I still think that it's him. And it's significant because Purdue athletics was largely segregated until at least 1947. And college baseball itself was segregated into the 1950s. As an example, Indiana University did not desegregate its team until 1956 with Eddie Whitehead. And I did research on Whitehead when I was in grad school at IU. And even then in 1956, he was still not allowed to play against teams in the South. He had to be elsewhere when IU played other teams. He could not be anywhere on the field. And going through the debris, the next Black baseball player that I found was Clyde Washington in 1961. So this is, it's a significant gap from 1903 to 1961. So moving from Purdue over to Lafayette now, early Lafayette Black baseball was centered on Emancipation Day celebrations. Emancipation Day, it was held on different days depending on when states freed their slaves. So in Indiana, it was usually held in September. And these celebrations were like the 4th of July. There were festivals, there were parades, there were speeches on racial progress, and there were sporting events, namely baseball. There are numerous articles from the late 1800s into the 1900s of Emancipation Day celebrations, usually ending with a baseball game being played. They would typically start with a parade, they'd then have some speeches, and then they would wind the day up with a large like barbecue and then baseball games. Just on a whim, I found more research, more newspaper articles from 1909 that talked about Black baseball games being played at League Park. These were charity games held to benefit elderly Black residents in the community. These games typically feature young and old teams, and in the case of the young team in 1909, Hal Kirby was the captain of that team. We'll be talking a lot more about Hal Kirby. He pops up quite a bit in this part of the presentation.
Do you know where League Park was at?
I'll get to that in a little bit.
Okay.
So in 1915, the first organized Black baseball team debuts in Lafayette. This is the article from 1915 announcing when they were formed. So they were the Lafayette Pals. The Pals were made up of local players like Hal Kirby and also some ex-professional players. I believe this article mentions there was a player from the Chicago team and also from the Louisville team that played for the Pals. So kind of a mix of people from who played professionally and who were from Lafayette. Eddie Morris was the manager. We'll be talking more about Eddie Morris again as well, so keep that name in mind. The Pals did not have a home park. Instead, they were always the visiting team. They were always traveling to wherever they had to play. And they typically played a lot of the small towns, both around Lafayette and Tippecanoe County. They played in Chalmers, Octagon, Montmorency, Buck Creek, just kind of anywhere in this general area. They also played local teams. They played a team from West Side, Holy Name Society, Shriner Grocery, and Linwood. One thing of note, in 1915, they turned to triple play, which is pretty cool. A lot of major league teams go years before they turn to triple play. So, that's good on them for doing that. And because they were always the visiting team, they would occasionally play at League Park. Now, League Park was really the first modern baseball park here in Lafayette. It was originally built in 1909 for a team in the Northern Indiana League. I think the league was like 4 different teams, like Wabash, Lafayette, maybe Crawfordsville, just a very small league that played for a couple of years. After that team left, the park was then rebuilt in 1914 for the Lafayette Red Sox, which was a semi-professional team that played from 1914 into 1917. The Red Sox disbanded in 1917 due to World War I. So I think they played until like June of that year, and then by that point, players were being called up to fight in the Army, so the Red Sox disbanded because of that. It was located south of Main Street Levee over here in what was called the River Bottoms, and it hosted the Red Sox, it hosted local teams, exhibition games, professional teams. I believe the Boston Braves played there in 1915 or 16. And it had a capacity of 2,300, somewhere in there. If you look, they had bleachers going along the third base side, and then they had the grandstand right there. And it featured modern amenities like showers and a parking lot for your automobiles. So, this was high-class stuff in 1914. And it was also a wooden structure rather than concrete and steel.
Is that the same area that flooded in 1913?
We'll find out in a second.
So
Wait,
you're
wait.
prepared for everything.
Oh, way ahead of you, man. Way ahead of you.
Yes.
So if you look here on this Google Maps screenshot that I took, League Park would have been roughly like in this area here. Like where Tapawingo Drive, that extension coming off of South Street going over to River Road, it would have been in that area there up along the railroad tracks. When you look at the picture that I just had, you can see the railroad tracks going back behind the outfield wall. So after the Red Sox disbanded in 1917, League Park kind of became this place where a lot of other things happened. Camp Purdue played there in 1918. They played at least one game that I know of. Camp Purdue was a military training ground during World War I. From 1919 to 1921, it was home to a second Lafayette Red Sox. This was originally a Monon Shops team that somehow decided they wanted to be called the Red Sox, and so they decided to call themselves the Red Sox. After that, after the Red Sox disbanded, it became a riding academy for horses. Then it became a football field for West Lafayette High School, then a golf course. And finally, I think it was demolished around 1933. And the reason I say that is because when the Wabash River flooded that year, a Journal and Courier reporter was taken up in the air by Lawrence Eretz of Eretz Airport. And the reporter noted that when they got over the site of League Park, they could see the grandstand protruding from the water. So my guess is that because it was a wooden structure, it had been flooded multiple times. It was probably about 25 years old or so at that point. It probably came down sometime by the mid-30s, would be my guess. I've not seen anything definitive saying League Park was torn down on this date. But it gets really hard to find anything on League Park after 1933. So, and even by 33, it was a struggle to find anything on League Park. So the Pals played at League Park. They played a benefit game for the Red Cross in 1917. The Red Sox manager donated the use of the park for free to the teams. Westside beat the Pals, but silver lining was that they raised about $50 to send to the Red Cross for bandages that would then be sent over to Europe for the war effort. So the Pals continued playing into 1920s. And the last mention that I found was in 1924 when they failed to appear for a game against the Woodmen. I don't know who the Woodmen were. I envisioned a bunch of Paul Bunyan's with baseball bats, but I don't know. Whatever. They were the Woodmen. In May of 1925, we start to see the Lafayette radios, which I believe more from the Pals because every now and then I would see a player who was with the radios who I recognized from playing with the Pals, including Eddie Morris, for starters. Morris owned the Radio Cafe, which was located at 14th and Hartford Streets down by St. E. And this was a cafe, which I'm guessing was called the Radio Cafe because it had a radio, and radio being a novelty at that time, you know, it was like, oh, come down to the cafe, listen to the radio, smoke your cigar, have a good time. And I thank the Historical Association for providing me with this clipping because I actually had no idea until about 2 days ago that Morris owned a cafe. So that was very, very worthwhile to know about that. So who were the radios? Well, they played a similar schedule to the Pals, always the road team. They played a lot of teams in small towns around the area, from Colburn, Independence, Chalmers, Mulberry, and Green Hill, amongst others. A lot of cat names in there. I'm not entirely sure why. They also played local teams like the South End Cubs, Monon Shops, and the Shamrocks. And they played at Columbian Park at the site of where Loeb Stadium is now at Main and Wallace. That was just originally like an open lot with the baseball diamond. So they played there before Loeb Stadium was actually built. And they also played at Jeff High School's baseball stadium too, or baseball field. And the last game that I found for the radios was in 1928. It's possible they played games beyond 1928. It's just that the Journal and Courier probably wasn't covering them anymore. So who knows when they actually really stopped playing. So as part of this, I really wanted to find out who were the Pals and the radios, like who were individual players, really trying to flesh this out. Problem is that the articles are usually not very informative at all. It's usually maybe 4 sentences if you're lucky, very quick, brief overviews of the game. It gives you a score, and that's about it. And the coverage usually focused on their opponents too. Very, very rarely did it actually include like something that the Pals did. It's there, but not very often. And when players were identified, they were typically just by their last name. It was never by first name. Maybe a first initial, as in the case with this one, but that was very rare. That never happened. Until I found this article, which I don't know if you want to call it divine intervention or just a stroke of good luck, whatever you want to call it. But I just randomly found this article one day in newspapers.com. What happened was there was a car crash in 1929 on 43 North going up towards Brookston. And as part of this car accident, there were 5 radio players involved in the accident. And all 5 were listed with their full names, first and last names. Bingo. So at that point, I was finally able to get an idea of who some of these guys were, and I've identified 3 of them. I've identified Hal Kirby, Otto Bohannon, and Coy Monroe. So the first one is Otto Bohannon, whose first name was actually Admiral. Admiral was born in 1901 in Tennessee and moved to Lafayette in 1909. All these black players moved up here to Lafayette during that time as part of the Great Migration. So every player that I mentioned here was born actually in Tennessee of all places. Everyone was born in Tennessee, and they all moved up to Lafayette at some point. Bohannon attended Lincoln School, then Jefferson School. He was a prominent athlete. I've not found his senior photo in a Nautilus yearbook. I found a picture of him with the interclass baseball team at Jeff High School, I think in 1920. But the problem is that he's the only black player on the team, and he's at the very side of the photograph. So you can't really see who he is. Admiral worked for Loeb department store, and he pitched for the Pals in 1919 and the Radios in 1927. At least that's what I found just by the newspaper articles. He probably pitched more games for them, but those are the only ones that I could find. And he passed away in 1932 after an illness.
Question, on these guys, once you had full names, were you able to use any census data?
Well, just only to verify like where they were born and where they lived. I ended up finding like their obituaries, and then I looked them up. When I found out like they went to Jeff High School, I then went into the Nautilus yearbooks. As a TCPL, we have an almost entirely complete collection of Nautilus yearbooks. So I ended up using those to kind of flesh all this out. So Admiral had a brother, Arvillo Bohannon, also born in Tennessee and moved to Lafayette in 1909. Arvillo also went to Lincoln and Jeff, and there was a 1919 newspaper article that Mary Anthrop gave me. Thank you, Miss Anthrop. And in that article, the article mentioned grammar school baseball teams, and Lincoln being one of those grammar schools that had a baseball team, and Bohannon is mentioned in that article. And given at this time that Lincoln only went up to 8th grade, and Arvillo probably would have been about 11 years old or so, it has to have been Arvillo Bohannon mentioned in that article, playing for the Lincoln baseball team. And oddly enough, those baseball teams played at League Park, and League Park wasn't flooded. So League Park really does factor in quite a bit. In the Nautilus yearbook for his senior year, which is where this photo comes from, Arvillo is mentioned as being an athlete of the highest degree who played baseball, basketball, and ran track. He played with the Radios, and he died in a car accident in 1936. Coy Monroe. Coy Monroe was kind of an interesting one to discover. He was born in 1906 in Tennessee. I don't know when he moved to Lafayette exactly. He was a classmate of Arvillo's, but I can't find a senior picture of him in the Nautilus, so he may have dropped out before he graduated. In 1952, he was involved in an altercation with Ernie Hall, who was Purdue University's first black basketball player. What happened was that Hall was accused of pulling a knife on Coy Monroe at a party, and because of that, he was kicked off the basketball team. Case went to trial, and he was actually acquitted when it turned out that it was Monroe who pulled the knife on Hall, and Hall attacked him in self-defense. But even though he was acquitted, he was still not allowed back on Purdue's basketball team because of that. And Monroe passed away in 1976. His obituary is interesting because it listed him as being about, I think, 70 at the time. But in 1952, he was listed as being 40 years old, which meant he would have been born in 1912. So I don't know what happened there. Something got mixed up. So yeah, I don't know what age exactly he was when he passed away. And then finally, Hal Kirby, who I mentioned already. Kirby was born in 1891 in Tennessee. He was involved in Lafayette baseball as early as 1909 with those charity games that I mentioned earlier. Kirby served in World War I, which is where this photo comes from. This comes from the Tippecanoe County Honor Roll, which was created in 1919 after the war ended, and it featured every citizen from the county who served in the conflict. But all black soldiers who served in the conflict in the county were put in the very back pages of the book. I think there were 18 black soldiers from Tippecanoe County who served in World War I. All of them were on the last 3 pages of the book. Kirby played for both the Pals and the Radios, and he ended up living a very long and fruitful life, passing away in 1985, so he would have been almost 100 when he died. So, very long life. So what's the significance then of the pals and radios? Well, it means Lafayette had its own black teams for 14, 15-ish years, something like that, which really is remarkable given that they were never affiliated with any league. So they had no league resources to draw upon to keep themselves, supported. And what it meant was that it was an opportunity to play baseball and gain notoriety and respect. In the obituaries for the Bohannons, both of them are mentioned as being fine athletes in Lafayette. So playing baseball really did earn them a status in the face of segregation. The Pals played at least 47 games that I found from 1915 to 1924. I have not found any games in 1918 or 1920. I think with 1918 was probably because most of those players would have been in the military fighting the war, so they probably just disbanded for the year. But I don't know what would have happened in 1920 to explain why I can't find any games. Maybe they were there and I just haven't found them for whatever reason. Then the radios played at least 17 games that I found from 1925 to 1928. Probably played longer, just haven't found them because the Drone Courier may have stopped covering them by that point. And finally, I want to do the last section, which is exhibitions, World War II, and Jackie Robinson. So exhibition games were vital to black teams because they were an extra source of revenue as they traveled across the country. And there's a book called Race Ball by Rob Ruck, which is a very, very good examination of black baseball. And Ruck wrote that exhibition games were a bridge to white communities because black teams come to smaller communities like Lafayette versus Chicago or Indianapolis. These were vital to sort of lowering discrimination in a way. It took black baseball to smaller markets. So it showed white fans that black baseball was on par, sometimes even superior to white baseball. But exhibition games were not easy to do. Teams faced harsh travel and living conditions. It was not unusual to travel 400 miles round trip just for an exhibition game. You drive 200 miles the morning of, play your game, drive 200 miles back to play your game the next day. And they were doing this 6-7 days a week. Very little time off. Usually a typical season for a Negro League team was about 200 games. Half of that was exhibition games. So you're just thinking about that, just constantly driving, and not in buses. This is like in your own personal car. This is cramming, 6-7 guys into a car and driving off to wherever you need to go next to play your game. So just brutal living conditions. And because of segregation, a lot of times they were not able to stay in hotels. They would have to stay in black hotels, which usually did not have good living conditions, or they would spend the night in the ballpark that they were going to play in the next day. So it's just really bad living conditions all around, but they still persevered. In Lafayette, the earliest exhibition game that I found was in 1915 against the West Baden Sprudels. Sprudels were formed at the hotel down in West Baden. They played against the team in French Lick. Both of those teams played against each other for the entertainment of the hotel guests down there because the springs were down there, those giant hotels. So these teams played against each other for entertainment purposes. Also visiting Lafayette at that time were the Chicago Union Giants, who were another early Negro League team, and Jules ABCs, who were a spinoff of the Indianapolis ABCs. The Indianapolis ABCs were a charter member of the Negro Leagues in 1920. And the first Negro League game after the formation of the Negro Leagues was played in Indianapolis by the ABCs. And ABC stands for American Brewing Company, just so you guys know, if you're curious about that. Yeah.
Did Oscar Charleston ever play here since he was from Indiana?
Not that I've found. I haven't found it yet, but I'm sure it's out there. I just haven't found it.
Yeah, maybe a box score with his name.
There are box scores with the Taylors. They were critical because Taylors played for the Sprudels and then they helped form the ABCs. So there are some famous players from that time, but I just haven't found them all yet. After the second Red Sox disbanded in 1921, so whenever they actually disbanded, exhibitions against black teams tailed off at that time because there really wasn't an actual baseball team here in Lafayette. It was just like those small community teams. But I did find that Lafayette Life played against the ABCs in a game in 1929 at Columbia Park. But by the 20s, their exhibitions were becoming sparse. Until the 30s, when a third Red Sox team was formed. There were 4 Red Sox teams, in case you're wondering. I'm only doing the first 3. I don't know what the fixation was on the name Red Sox, but man, did they run with it. So this 3rd Red Sox team was formed in 1935 with John Rosser as the manager. Gordon Graham from the Journal Courier was actually instrumental in forming this team as well. They were semi-professional, meaning that they all worked full-time jobs and played baseball on the side. So they got paid to play baseball, but it wasn't enough to actually make a living on. And at first they played at Columbia Park on the site where Loeb Stadium was built there in Maine and Wallace. And they entered the Indiana-Ohio League in 1936. And this league is interesting. I've not done a lot of research on this league yet, but it's significant because it featured 2 black teams in the league. So it was an integrated league in that sense, with Indianapolis and Dayton. So the teams, I call this a half step toward integration because what it was the team, there were still separate white and black teams. You didn't have a mix of white and black players on one team. They were still separated. But the fact that they were actually in the same league together seems significant. I just haven't seen where it stands in a larger context. So the 30s, we start seeing black teams visit Lafayette again. The very first one was the ABCs beating the Red Sox in 1936. And Graham is complimentary toward these teams. He wrote that baseball fans here in Lafayette love seeing the black baseball teams, and he also noted that they are fine athletes who are a credit to their race. Very supportive of black baseball. In 1940, at the site that I previously mentioned there, Columbia Park, Loeb Stadium was finally built. Loeb was constructed in 1940. It was donated by Bert Loeb, who owned Loeb Department Store. It was built to honor his father, Solomon Loeb. It had a capacity of 3,000. And at the time, it featured novelties such as lights for night games and a PA system. The PA system was noted at the time as just being very unusual, just because no teams invested in having a PA system at the time. Loeb became really just a cornerstone of Lafayette baseball. It's where the World Series was played for all those years. A lot of other games played there. You know, it was just a lot of history there. And you can read about that article in the bicentennial book. I wrote an article on Loeb, so you can have that to look forward to if you want.
I guess the zoo wasn't built then.
No, this is not, unless they just put the trees in the background. I don't know. Loeb was officially named after Bert Loeb in 1971, and it was finally demolished in 2019 and replaced with the Loeb Stadium that's there now. And one of those games that was played at Loeb was a game against the Kansas City Monarchs featuring Satchel Paige. Paige is kind of an enigma. If anyone's ever done baseball research, there's at least 3 different birth dates given for him. He started playing in the 1920s, kept playing into the 60s, appeared probably 2,000 games, probably more. We may not know because there's chances he played in some small town for an exhibition game that just wasn't recorded in a newspaper. So we may never know how many games he actually played in. And when you think about it also, if he was pitching into the 1960s, he was probably close to 60 years old by that point too. So he pitched a long time. So in this game, Paige pitched 3 innings. Kansas City won 7-2. Paige had no strikeouts. And Gordon Graham was livid. He was hot. In his Graham Crackers column the next day, Graham wrote that he was boiling. He was livid. As he put it, Paige dogged it. He failed to live up to expectations. He wrote that if yours truly has anything to say about it, Paige will never come back to Lafayette. He was adamant that Paige would never come back here. He wrote that the idea of the Monarchs being major league caliber was eyewash. Joke's kind of on him though, because that night the Monarchs had 4 players who are now in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So I don't know. Gordon, I don't know what happened here with Gordon. He must have had a bad day because this is kind of unusual for him. So did Paige really dog it? No, I don't think so. In 1938, while pitching in Venezuela, Paige suffered an arm injury and his arm went dead. He couldn't pitch anymore. It's believed now that he had a torn rotator cuff. And because at the time, torn rotator cuff just, they probably just didn't recognize what it was, and the rehabilitation for it was just non-existent. And it was several years actually before he started really pitching again on a consistent basis because of that. And he had to adjust his pitching repertoire because of that as well. He went from a power pitcher to a control pitcher. As he put it, his fastball went from blazing fast to just fast. So I don't know how you quantify going blazing fast, just fast, but it must have been a significant amount if that's the case. To add to that, Page had just pitched a complete game in Detroit a few days before coming to Lafayette. He pitched all 9 innings of that game. Also going with that, in official Negro League games that year, Page only pitched in 64 innings in 1941, which suggests that he probably was under some kind of like load management, rehabilitation program, not to pitch too much, otherwise he'd blow his arm out again. So I think because of that, Graham probably just didn't know about Page's injury. A lot of people didn't know about it at the time until the Monarchs started, they enlisted a New York Times reporter to follow them around and write about Page's injury and his recovery from it. So there's a chance that Graham probably just didn't know about it. I also think that because it was the Monarchs, and the Monarchs were one of the most famous Negro League teams, Graham set just such high expectations that anything less than that was going to be a total failure. And so I think because of that, Graham probably was just never going to be satisfied, and he was just going to have his bad day for whatever reason and write the way he did about Page. But overall, this Graham Crackers column was uncharacteristic of Graham. This is the only one where I found where he just completely tore apart a black team. So that game in 1941 was actually the last baseball game played in Lafayette during peacetime. Because in December of 41, Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States enters World War II. Once the United States entered World War II, baseball became significantly altered. And this is my personal favorite era of baseball history. I almost did my program on this, but I decided to do black baseball just because I wanted the challenge. And so what that meant was that starting in 1943, spring training was altered. Because of travel restrictions, teams were forced to train closer to home. The trains that they would have used to go to different cities were now being used to transport war materials coast to coast for the war effort. So now the teams couldn't travel as much on the trains. And because of that, Indiana just became a baseball hotbed. We had teams training all across the state, here in Lafayette, Bloomington, Muncie, Evansville, French Lick, everywhere. And they became known as the Limestone League. Now, as we all know, Indiana in March and April is not good weather. It's not fun. It's cold, it's rainy, it can be hot 1 minute, cold the next minute, it's just wild. So the weather ended up being a big factor for these teams training here. But Indiana at this time had major and minor league teams training. You had a Negro League team in Indianapolis, the Women's League, which is from a league of their own. They were in South Bend and Fort Wayne. You had college baseball, semi-pro baseball, and military bases, all having baseball teams here in the state of Indiana. It was just wild, smorgasbord of baseball. It's just awesome to look at. And just a quick map to kind of show you like what it meant. Teams could not train further west than the Mississippi River except for the 2 St. Louis clubs, and they could not train south of the Ohio River Mason-Dixon line. This is back at a time when there was no baseball on the West Coast, there was no baseball down south. So baseball at this time was still very much in the Midwest and the Northeast. And if you look at Indiana, you see that there are teams in Lafayette, Muncie, Terre Haute, Bloomington, French Lick, and Evansville. There were also teams that trained in Bedford, Richmond. Bloomington at one point had 3 teams training down there because the Indianapolis Indians trained along with the Cincinnati Reds and Syracuse team. They used IU's facilities. Cleveland used Purdue's facilities, and the Pirates occasionally used Ball State's facilities in Muncie, not all the time. So there's a lot of baseball going on in the state at this point. And also, as another name, it was also known as the long underwear circuit because of the cold weather at the time. So you can use either Limestone League or Long Underwear League interchangeably at this point. So what did baseball then look like in Lafayette during that time? Well, Cleveland played exhibitions at Loeb. The Red Sox played against major league and military teams that came here. And as the war progressed, more and more Negro League teams came here. I think this can be because a lot of semi-pro teams disbanded because of the war. So it was an opportunity for Negro League teams to kind of fill that void and get more games and more exposure. And among those teams were the Black Barons, the Cleveland Buckeyes, the Cubans, the American Giants, and once again, the Kansas City Monarchs. Which then leads to this particular game. So on July 11th, 1945, Jackie Robinson played here with the Monarchs against the Lafayette Red Sox. Page was with the Monarchs, but he did not pitch in that game. He only pitched on Sundays at that point. So he was with them. So he did circumvent Gordon Graham and his supposed barrier for coming back to Lafayette. There was a lot of hype before this game. Robinson was a famous athlete at UCLA, so he was highly anticipated when he came here to Lafayette. And this had been a wild game. You read the box score because it went 16 innings, 3-hour affair. 7-2, the Monarchs won. Robinson went 3 for 5 with 2 triples and scored 2 runs. The game, Lafayette tied the game in the 6th inning, and then they went hitless from the 8th inning to the 16th inning. At the top of the 16th, Robinson hit a triple and scored the first run that broke the tie in a 5-run rally for Kansas City. Then Lafayette didn't score any runs in the bottom of the 16th, and they lost the game. Remarkably, Red Sox pitcher Dale Davis pitched all 16 innings, notched 16 strikeouts. I really wish the box score listed how many pitches he threw. It does not, and that just irks me a little bit because it had been a staggering amount of pitches that he threw in that game. And so the Robinson game really represents sort of the last high point of black baseball here in Lafayette. Robinson signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers later on in 1945. The Monarchs came back to Lafayette in August of that year, and Robinson was not with the team because at that point he had signed with Brooklyn. He played with Brooklyn's minor league team in Montreal in 1946, and then debuted in 1947, integrating Major League Baseball, or you could also say, I guess, in a way, he reintegrated baseball based on the black players that we just discovered in the 1800s. Integration was great for one thing because it broke that racial barrier. It was bad for Negro League teams, though, because it was their downfall. Now all these white teams are raiding Negro League teams and taking all their star players for little to no money. So now these black teams, they can't survive because they're losing their star attractions, and they're going to the white teams who now have those star attractions. So they're losing money in the competition in this game. And Graham noted that in a column, I believe it was right after Robinson was announced to be with the Dodgers. And he called for fair compensation of black teams. You know, I'm not sure how many columnists at the time really called for fair compensation, but there were some who definitely did. But at the end of the day, the white teams did what they wanted, and they took these black players for little to no money at all. And they just completely raided the Negro Leagues. So because the Negro League teams were disbanding, that meant that fewer and fewer were coming here to Lafayette to play the Red Sox. They continued playing Negro League teams after the war, even right up to when they disbanded in 1952. And this included Clowns, Memphis Red Sox, and the Philadelphia Stars, among others. I haven't found any players of note who would have played for these particular teams in the post-war years. Willie Mays, I know, played for Birmingham, but I don't think Birmingham came to Lafayette at that time. So I haven't found anyone just yet. And finally, the Red Sox themselves disbanded in 1952. They disbanded, I think, in June of that year because there were other entertainment options at that point, and the Red Sox couldn't compete. And then finally, my final thoughts. Baseball in Lafayette is far more diverse than I initially realized and what other people have initially written about. We now know that there was a cohesive black baseball scene for a good stretch of time. Lafayette became a stopping point for pioneering black baseball players, ranging from Bud Fowler to Page to Robinson and many others. And these games are an example of the black community persevering in the face of exclusion. And it was just that sort of relentless persistence to finally achieve racial equality that led to the integration of baseball finally. That is it.
You're probably familiar with Society of American Baseball Research.
Oh, yeah.
They published an article, or they have baseball biographies.
Mm-hmm.
They published one a couple of months ago, fairly recently, that said that they think there was a black player that played in the majors before Moses Walker.
It's possible.
And he was a college player, first baseman, I think. I wish I could remember his name, but he was one of these guys, the team that was playing was short of a couple of players.
Yeah.
And they said, oh, who's at the local college, and they picked him up. So that might be of interest to you. Also, these black baseball teams that were playing, they often play exhibitions against the white major league teams.
Yes.
And there was an article a few years ago, again, Society for American Baseball Research, that they looked and cataloged all the games between, I don't know, 1920 and 1940s. Just hundreds of them.
Oh, yeah.
And the black baseball teams played at about a 520 clip against the majors.
Yeah.
So they won the majority of the games and not by a tiny margin. either.
Yeah. They won the majority of their games against semi-pro teams too.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm talking about
Yeah.
major,
Oh, yeah.
white major league teams.
Yeah.
So, you know, that was interesting. And last thing I wanted to mention, you said Satchel Paige pitched into his sixties. I think the best date for his birth is 1906.
Sounds about
And
right.
he pitched through the, early fifties in the majors. But then Charles O'Finley, when he bought the,
Yeah.
then Kansas City Athletics, he brought Satchel Paige in as a, I don't know, a box office draw. You know, oh, this would be great, have this old man pitch, because heck, he debuted for Cleveland in 48.
Yeah.
He went 6-1 down the stretch.
Oh, yeah.
The Indians wouldn't have won the pennant without him. But anyway, he pitched against the Red Sox, which, you know, 2 years later, the Red Sox won the World Series. They had a pretty good team. He only faced 9 batters, and they just figured he'd go out there and, you know, but he was competitive. He struck out 3, didn't walk anybody, only gave up 1 hit, a double to Crawley Yastrzemski. And they were trying to hit him.
Yeah.
You know, they just had, you know, the article I read said, well, we kind of agreed, he's 59 years old, we're not gonna bunt on him, that just wouldn't be fair.
Yeah.
You know, but they were trying to hit him,
Oh, yeah.
and they couldn't, except for Yastrzemski. So, he was a great player.
He was.
Hope it didn't bore anybody. I love baseball. And my grandfather loves Satchel Paige.
Yeah.
With the addition of the Negro League stats into Major League Baseball record keeping, do you think that's gonna open up more avenues for research like you've done?
Oh, I think it already has. I think they've been doing research on this stuff for 20 years at least, because they, at one point, the Hall of Fame, over like a 20-year period, only inducted like 5 black baseball players. And since that time, it's been, I think, almost 20 who've been inducted because of research like this. So it's been going on a long time. Seamheads has said that at some point they'd like to cover semi-pro teams, like the exhibitions, like against the Red Sox. I don't know when that ever will be, but I'm kind of stockpiling research when that day comes, you know.
Any other questions for Matt?
Yeah, I got just a general baseball question. Purdue University, you know, played their first baseball season in 1874, 1875. And they played 4 Lafayette teams.
Yeah.
I can't remember the Lafayette Reds.
I think one was the Nationals.
But the place they played sports in that very first year was the YMCA field. Never been able to find out what YMCA.
That doesn't ring a bell with me. The only one I know of, like the earliest field that I found was a field somewhere down by like Wabash Avenue, like next to the canal, which was like next to a distillery, but I have not, it's really hard to find where they, I think honestly, they would just play on any open lot they could find.
Maybe Shamrock Park ball field, or we used to play softball
Maybe.
down there.
Yeah.
A good area.
You mentioned that, you know, how much you would have loved to know how many pitches Satchel Paige pitched in that one game. What are a couple things that, as you were doing your research, that you would just absolutely have loved to have been there that you couldn't find? There had to be at least one.
Well, yeah, the Jackie Robinson game for sure. Oh, man. I don't know. There's a lot.
I just know it's hard to put all together.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing that the newspapers or, you know, any recorded history, you know, there's facts like that that get lost because everybody knows where YMCA, so why would anybody write it down? Everybody knows where it's at.
Right.
And then over a couple of generations, it just gets lost.
I still see that today, whether it's the
Yeah.
Journal and Courier, the Expo, what they're talking about a new business. They don't even tell where it is. It happens this week. Yeah, yeah, pretty poor journalism.
If you run across things in your research, that were more about the effects on society or society's effects on baseball.
You mean like the effects of like discrimination or just society in
Any
general?
Attitude changes or.
I think the biggest one is like when you compare when Bud Fowler was here in the 1800s, the way that they wrote about him, to when Gordon Graham wrote about black baseball teams in the 1930s and 40s. Like it was a much different, he had a much different perspective at that point, like, it wasn't. I don't think Graham doesn't seem to, he didn't seem to argue for like full integration, at least not that I have seen, but he was favorable towards like black baseball teams visiting Lafayette. So I think that's just the biggest one, is just sort of that evolution of racial biases from the 1800s into the 1900s.
I first want to say thank you for the contribution that you made to this, because it's fascinating history. Secondly, I'm curious, because we talked about the emancipation celebrations and things that happened, particularly in the African American churches, and I'm wondering if there were any bulletins or things from, whether it be Bethel AME or Second Baptist Church, that might have documented some of this.
Not that I have found, but I didn't look in those, I didn't look in that area, I just stuck to the newspapers for the Emancipation Day stuff. I didn't really look much beyond that, except for like a couple of like monographs that kind of just elaborated more on like what Emancipation Day meant, but I didn't find anything from like the churches that mentioned anything about that.
For whatever reason, I was checking on the Green Book online, and where it was acceptable, safe for blacks to get hospitality services. And of course, was particularly interested in whether any place was listed in Lafayette. There was one cafe or restaurant listed in the Hartford area. Now that you have mentioned somebody owned one, started one, whatever, it would be worthwhile to take the address that you identified, go
Oh,
back and look in the Green Book and see whether those are the same.
Right. And I don't know, like in the 40s when like the Monarchs came here, I don't know where they would have stayed. I've not been able to figure that out. I don't know if maybe they just left as soon as they finished the game and went somewhere else, or if they actually did stay here in Lafayette for the night. I've not been able to figure that part out. So it's kind of sketchy to figure out like where they would have stayed.
I'd love to know whether it's the same eatery
Yeah,
that's referenced in both of those spots.
might have been.
You're gonna turn this into an article for the bicycle?
Oh, yeah. Well, no.
Several articles.
Well, no, hold on now, because I told Claire a long time ago, I'm done writing baseball articles. I got my fill. I did 35 or 6.
I think, yeah, it was at least 5.
Yeah, it was at least 5. We talked about doing a black baseball article, but I couldn't squeeze all of that into 600 words. So, what?
More than one.
I mentioned Bud Fowler in one of those articles, and the Jackie Robinson game ended up being its own article in its own right.
Okay.
So there is stuff in there, it's just not gonna be as in-depth as this presentation, because there was way more than I ever expected when I started doing this.
So do you have a passion for baseball in general?
Oh, yeah. Guys?
Yes, yes.
You're not a Yankees fan.
No.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Okay. Every once in a while they pop up, you know,
Oh, no.
like weeds.
All right, well, if there are no other questions for Matt, let's give him another round of applause. Thank you so much for being here.